What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we'll be diving back into the starter decks, going over the other half of the new starter decks coming to Arena for most players. Unless you're a new player, these decks are decks that you're slowly unlocking as you progress your way through the new player entry into Arena. With that being said, these are starter decks you are going to get for free. I did have a couple people ask me, are these decks going to be coming to free for all players? And typically, right as we get closer to rotation, we'll be going through some, little brief announcements and things like that with some news, kind of give players a heads up as to what to expect when it comes to rotation in Arena. And these starter decks are part of that whole block. If you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But let's just dive into the decks and let's just talk about it. Just wanted to give a special shout out to the channel members that you see your names here. These are the people who support the channel by either clicking the join button that's down below right next to the subscribe button if you want to get your name here on this list, or you can click the link in the description. I do appreciate it as it does help support the channel. Now on with your video. If you played in the event that happened about a week prior to me recording, these decks were available to preview, I guess, for majority of players for free. You did get, I guess, like 2 cards if you won 2 games. But essentially, you have to get preview the decks that we be getting as the new starter decks for the new rotation season. And the first deck up is Avalanche. It's a pretty interesting kind of rampy Simic style deck that kind of utilizes some of the cards as well as utilizing snow permanents to kind of ramp up and take advantage of your opponent. That way, trying to get to large amounts of mana so you can play your really big creatures. Overall, it's a pretty interesting deck. It is kind of like a traditional ramp and stomp kind of style of deck. It does have some of the newer cards from the newer sets, of course, which is definitely cool. And it's definitely cool to see them play around some of the mechanics that got introduced in the various sets across the past year or so. With that being said, the first card up in the deck is Ascendant Spirit. It's one of those things with starter decks that they only give you one of each rare and mythic that are in the deck, so you are going to only get one ofs. And if you're looking for ways to upgrade any of the decks I go over in today's video, upgrading the rares is usually one of the good first go-to places because drawing these cards consistently will give you a higher and higher chance to win. But nonetheless, these decks are pretty okay to get started with right off the shell. I also think with the way post-rotation things will kind of feel a little bit more balanced than they kind of currently do have in the current standard meta as a whole, as the power level I think is dramatically crazy compared to something like this. I do think we're kind of going a peg down, so that is beneficial in that sense. But nonetheless, let's get back to the deck and let's just talk about it. So Ascended Spirit's an interesting card here. It's a 1/1 for 1. You can pay 2 snow, it can make it a 2/3. You pay 3 snow, you can make it a 4/4. And you can pay you pay 4 snow, you put 2+1/+1 counters on it, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So essentially, it's a pretty cool card that, has utilities that can do various things, which is definitely pretty cool when it comes to playing this style of deck. And it's slowly one of those things, if your opponent doesn't deal with it early, it can get out of hand pretty quickly, especially the idea that it's a tempo card that as it deals damage to your opponent, you're going to slowly refill your hand back up, which is definitely very good, especially in this style of deck. The next card up is Bubble Snare. This is kind of like a way to kind of lock down your opponent's creatures. You can play it for 1 mana, enters battlefield. If it was kicked, tap Enchanted Creature. Enchanted Creature doesn't untap during its controller's on tap step. So this is one of those things. In the early game, until you get to like 4 mana, you can play it on a creature, and then if your opponent decides to attack in, that creature now for the rest of the game doesn't untap unless they get rid of Bubble Snare. In the late game, you can play the 4 mana and immediately tap that creature, and then they can't do anything about it. And it's now tapped until they get rid of the Bubble Snare. Next card up after that is Blizzard Brawl. It's a 1 mana snow sorcery that choose target creature we control and target creature we don't control. If we control 3 or more snow permanents, the creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains indestructible in a turn, and those creatures fight each other. So essentially, fighting is a way that they each deal damage to each other equal to each other's power. And typically, the goal here is to have your creature stomp the other creature and kill it in the process. Given the creature indestructible is definitely a good benefit. And as we are a snow deck, we are playing snow lands, so we'll hopefully get to that 3 snow permanents on the battlefield, and therefore hopefully going to get the indestructibility and the additional +1/+0. Following that, in the 2-drop slot, we have Avalanche Collar. It's a 2 mana 1/3 with the ability that you can tap 2. Target snow lane you control becomes a 4/4 elemental creature token with hexproof and haste until end of turn. It is still land. The one benefit here is you can actually cast it on a land that had just entered the battlefield. Even if the land can tap for mana, once it becomes a creature, it still has summoning sickness, so therefore you can't technically attack in with the land. But given the creature a haste, it allows that land to immediately attack, as well as hexproof is also very good, so now your opponent can't actually direct remove it, so your opponent can't remove your land if it becomes a creature and attacks into their face. Emergency Weakness is another card. It's another interesting ramp card here. There is a little bit of ramp in the deck, and if you can kind of get multiple lands out in the battlefield in a single turn, then play this, you are going to get a much larger land creature that's going to come onto the battlefield. But essentially, this card does is just search your library for a basic land card, puts it on the battlefield tapped, and that land becomes a 0/0 green-blue fractal creature, and that is still a land. And you get a bit of +1/+1 counter on it for each land you had enter the battlefield under your control. So if you let's play your initial land for turn and then play this card, it's going to be a 2/2. If you're able to play additional lands, it'll get even higher. The goal here is probably 2/2 is fine. Getting a 3/3 or 4/4 is very nice, but it's not one of those things you need to hold on to and try to set up. You can play this on turn 2 if you want to just kind of ramp up and also have a creature out on the battlefield while also playing a card, which is definitely pretty cool. You got Lotus Cobra. It's a 2-mana 2/1 with landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we get to add 1 mana. So the benefit here with the ramp deck, you're trying to play lands into the battlefield. You tap a mana to play those lands onto the battlefield by playing ramp spells. And whenever those lands come on the battlefield, as long as Lotus Cobra is out on the battlefield, you're going to produce mana even though those lands may come in the battlefield tapped, which then allows us to play even more ramps kind of spells or play more spells in general, which is definitely beneficial for the deck as a whole. Just being able to play your bigger spells quicker by ramping up much quicker is definitely a good thing. Then you got Sculpt Over the Winter is another great card for the deck. It's a 2-mana 2/2 with the ability that gets to untap target snow land. So essentially you can, tap 3 of your snow lands, untap 1, and then tap another one and have 4 mana, which sets up to play maybe your 4-drop on a turn early, which is definitely awesome. Get in that kind of higher end of your curve is always very good, especially in the earlier game when your opponent doesn't have as many ways to deal with it. And this is just one of those great cards that synergizes very well with snow permanents. Then we have Gretchen, the Titch Wallow. I haven't actually had a lot of play with this card, but it's definitely a very interesting card in the sense that it has an ability. It's a 0/4 for 2 mana, and it has a 4 mana ability that you can draw a card and you get to put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. So essentially, it is a Eureka Moment in a creature. It is a 1-of in the deck in the starter. It is only uncommon, and it's one of those interesting things in the sense that it can be a nice blocker, especially in the early game, because a lot of creatures aren't super large. Most creatures are 2/1s, 2/2s, maybe 3/2s, depending on the situation and what turn. So this definitely blocks very well, and having the ability to draw the card in the later game as you get 4 mana and then be able to kind of ramp it that way is also very good. So just having it on a creature, it just allows you, as long as you have maybe empty mana that you're not using, you can always pay it to this card and hopefully just either just draw a card and just fill your hand back up, or possibly even get a little bit of ramp in the process. Then we got Simone Quandrick's Prodigy. It's 2-mana 1/2 with the ability that you can tap 1 and tap it. You get to put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. So you can do something like this at the end of your opponent's turn. Kind of ramp up before you go, and then you untap that land, and you have additional land on your turn, which is always beneficial. And then 4 mana and tap it, you get to draw a card. If you control 8 or more lands, you get to draw 2 cards instead. So the game, she is more of a setup card, and then once you get closer to the later game, she can help refill your hand back up as you kind of play a lot of your spells in the early game to ramp up. And then if you get over 8 lands, you get that additional card, which definitely fills up your hand very, very quickly for 4 mana, which is definitely pretty cool to have a 4 mana draw 2 kind of card spell in the later games when you're really looking for that answer, maybe to finish off your opponent. You get the 1 copy of the Quandrick's Command. It's a 3-mana instant speed spell. Choose to return target creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand. So if maybe your opponent has a pesky blocker or planeswalker that you unfortunately can't deal with at the moment, you can bounce it back to their hand. Second ability is you get to counter target artifact or enchantment spell. There's some of them in the format, so being able to counter that pesky enchantment or artifact spell is always very good. And third ability is you get to put 2+1/+1 counters on target creature, which if maybe, for example, you catch your opponent off guard, block with one of your creatures, pump it by 2+1/+1 counters. Always beneficial for you to get those additional damage in, and maybe not have an opponent, swing it with a creature that they don't really want to lose, but then block with a creature that you can then pump to make it bigger is definitely always very good. And then the last ability, which is I think the best ability of the card, especially in a sense if you ever play against any sort of mill, target player shuffles up to 3 target cards from their graveyard into their library, so it allows you to kind of put cards back that may have been removed or you may have played already, like your spells, back into your deck, so you have a higher chance of drawing them again and then being able to play them a second time, which is always very good. Then in the 4-drop slot, we have Spirit of the Alder Guard, a 4-mana 0/4. When it enters the battlefield, we search our library for a snow land card, reveal it, put it into our hand. We are playing all snow lands. Also, our snow dual lands are in the deck. And then it gets +1/+0 for each other snow permanent you control. So not much in the way of actual snow physical permanents, as there's some snow creatures, but not many. But essentially, as if we have other creatures out on the battlefield that aren't snow permanents, but we have our snow lands out, it's at least going to come out into the battlefield as a 0/4, and then the following turn, once we play that land, it can come out into the battlefield as a 5/4, and it just slowly grows over the game. And if your opponent doesn't deal with it, it's just a big creature that just swings in for big damage the whole game. Then we have Eureka Moment, just like kind of the Gretchen. It's Eureka Moment. It's a 4-mana instant spell. Draw 2 cards. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. So essentially, it's a draw to put a land onto the battlefield. Kind of just a tempo card. Play it at the end of your opponent's turn. Draw 2 cards. Put a land out on their turn. Then play the additional land on your following turn. Kind of one of those things. It just digs a little bit deeper into the deck to help keep that tempo up and ramp you much quicker. Then with the Quandrick Cultivator, yet again another tempo card. It comes out on the battlefield as a 4-mana 3/4. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic forest or island card, put that card onto the battlefield, and shuffle. So, just another card that helps us ramp. It's a solid blocker. It's a 3/4. It can attack in if you need to, because most of our creatures that are much larger aren't into the top end of the deck. But on turn 4, it's a very solid card that just kind of helps you ramp up even faster. It gets you up to the higher end. And the land doesn't even come to the battlefield tap, so you can actually use that mana to play maybe another spell if you have open mana to play possibly a 2-drop or even a 1-drop spell. So overall, pretty decent card that allows you just to kind of ramp up that much faster. Then you get the Berg Stride. It's a 2 of in the deck. It's a 5-mana 4/4. When it enters the battlefield, tap target artifact or creature. Attack target artifact or creature an opponent controls. If no mana is spent to cast that spell, that permanent doesn't untap during its controller's on tap step. So you're gonna get the tap, not controller. The creature's not going to untap, or artifact's not going to untap during your controller's on tap step, because we have mostly snow mana except for one pathway in the deck. So essentially that card's not going to untap, and it's going to lock your opponent down, maybe allowing you to attack him more aggressively on your turn. And then the following turn, that creature's not going to hit you back in the face, which is definitely very good, especially when you're trying to finish off your opponent. Then we have one copy of the Graven Lore, a very solid draw card. It's no instant. You get to scry X, where X is the amount of snow spent to cast this spell, and then draw 3 cards. So you can scry up to 5, which is awesome, and then get to pick the 3 cards you want to draw. If you don't like any of them, put them all on the bottom and just draw 3 random cards, but allows you to kind of pick and choose what you want and what you don't want to draw from this card. So overall, very solid tempo card that helps you maybe try to finish off that, your opponent towards the end of the game. Then you have Ashaya, a very interesting card here that kind of feels very interesting in why, it's an interesting add to the card deck, in the sense that it enters, its power and toughness equal to the number of lands we control, and non-token creatures you control are forest lands in addition to their other types. So essentially now all our creatures are lands, so it even pumps it up even more, so you have a bunch of creatures on the battlefield as this comes out, even on turn 5. It could be like a 8/8, 9/9, depending on how many creatures that is. So overall, a card that hits with an impact, and if your opponent doesn't deal with it, it's definitely something that, slows them down from what they're doing. Though the creatures that may have come out on the battlefield as this comes out, or if the creature comes out after this has already been on the battlefield, the creatures still do have summon sickness, so they can't tap like mana like as if it was a land. So that is the one downfall to the card. But other than that, it's a very great card. Like, it's the most powerful card in the deck just because of its star ability. But overall, pretty solid card. You got Rootless U. It's a 5-mana 5/4. When it dies, you get to search your library for a creature card with a power or toughness 6 or greater, reveal it to put into our hand, and then shuffle. So the idea here is this is the card that's going to help us search for something like an Ashaya, maybe search for something like an Breaker Kraken, Bookworm. Depending on what the situation is, we can search for any of those cards. The Ashaya is probably the more than likely thing, just because it only costs 5 mana. But depending on the situation, Breaker Kraken, for example, as we kind of get into it, does cost less for each snowland we control. And the Bookworm is just a very solid card that helps us kind of tempo our opponent. We get to gain 3 life, draw a card, which is definitely very solid, and it also has trample. But other than that, it's definitely a good card that helps us, when this dies, we can attack it aggressively, and if our opponent doesn't block it, it hits in for 5. If they do block it and kill it, we do get a bigger creature to play maybe the following turn. Now, as we get into our top end of the deck, we have Bookworm as an 8-mana 7/7 trample. Like I just said, it enters the battlefield, we gain 3 life, we get to draw a card. Has another good ability too. For 3 mana, we can put it from we can put Bookworm from our graveyard into our library there from the top. So essentially, if it does die, puts it back in our library there from the top, and then we just gotta draw a couple cards and eventually draw again, and then play it again on our opponent. So it's one of those pesky cards that our opponent has to kind of get rid of by exiling if they don't want us to play it over and over again, if it is going to die over and over again. Then the last card in the deck is Breaker Kraken. It's a 12-mana 8/8. This spell does cost 1 less for each snowland you control. So if you have 6 snowlands out, it's going to cost 6 colorless less. So therefore, it's going to be a 6-mana 8/8. When it enters the battlefield, artifacts and creatures target opponents don't untap during untap step. And then we get to return 3 snowlands we control to their owner's hand, and return it from the battlefield to our hand. So the idea here is we can kind of tempo our opponent. We can play it out. Tap all their things that they may have attacked in the turn prior to us playing it. And then if we want to in the later game, we can bounce back 3 of our snow lands, bounce it back, and then be able to recast it again if we're trying to just keep our opponent locked down. It's definitely a pretty interesting card. It's not a very great card, but it's definitely a very interesting card in the sense that it does get cheaper as the game goes on, and it just have a way for us to kind of replay it in sort of a cycle. And then overall, the mana base is pretty straightforward. It is 26 land mana base, which is definitely pretty interesting. I do think it's just because it's a very rampy style deck, but it is 10 snow covered islands, 7 snow covered forests, 1 of the blue-green pathways, and 4 of the Rimwood Falls. So overall, very interesting rampy style deck that definitely can get a jump on your opponent. Definitely, if you get the ramp going very early, you can definitely play, you know, your big creatures by like turn 4 or turn 5, depending on how well the ramp is going. So overall, pretty solid deck that can catch an opponent by surprise. So this next deck up on the list is the Armed and Dangerous starter deck. It's definitely a very interesting starter deck. It's a warrior equipment, tribal style deck. Overall, the goal here is just playing a bunch of warriors. We have things that can pump up the warriors, and we're also playing equipments to help synergize with those warriors. So overall, the goal of the deck is just to play warriors, equip the warriors, swinging for big damage. It's a very basic aggro style deck, and you know, it does have a warrior lord, and the goal here is just to hit your opponent in its face as quickly as possible, as hard as possible. So the one drop, we have Cut Sail Cleric. It's a 1-mana 1/1 flyer with kicker. If it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, tap up to 2 target creatures. So essentially, it's one of those things in the later game, you can tap down your opponent's things, allowing you to maybe get in for that free damage or prevent your opponent from having blockers. Other than that, it's a 1-mana 1/1 flyer, which is also very solid. You know, equipping a flyer, especially if your opponent doesn't play any flyers, allows you to get in for some of that free damage. Then we have Resolute Strike. It's a 1-mana instant spell. Target creature gets +2/+2 into end of turn, and if it's a warrior, you may attach an equipment you control to it. So a lot of our equipments have equipment costs of like 2 or more. For 1 mana, we can now slide that equipment over for free essentially, or for 1 mana. And then allow us to swing in maybe for that additional damage. You know, you can swing something like our Scavenge Blade over onto our Flyblade Charger. Our opponent may not block our Flyblade Charger because it's only a 1/1, but they don't get hit for the 1 point of damage. But now we make it a 2/3/1 by equipping the sword to it, and now we get that additional damage. We get the +2/+0, then the +2/+2, and now we're hitting our opponent in the face very, very hard. And then the next card up, like I said, is the Fireblade Charge. It's a 1-mana 1/1. If you've been playing Magic a while, you've probably seen this card in mono red, but it's a very solid card in this deck as well. As long as it's equipped, it has haste, and whenever it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So initially, it's only a 1/1, so it's only paying something for 1 damage. But once you start putting equipments on it, and our opponent does kill it in that process, if it's a 3/3 or 3/1 or something like that, 3 damage is going to go anywhere we choose, and we can take out maybe 2 creatures in the process of them blocking this one. Then we get the Berserker Bezkir Shieldmate. I was about to say Berserker, but it's Bezkir's Shieldmate. 2-mana 2/1. When it dies, you get to create a 1/1 white human warrior creature token. So it's just a creature that replaces itself even if it does die, which is definitely pretty good for the deck, as it kind of keeps our board presence pretty much there, even if our opponent is slowly killing off our creatures. Then you got the Dancing Sword. It's a new card from, Adventures from Forgotten Realms. Equipped creature gets +2/+1. Whenever equipped creature dies, you may have Dancing Sword become a 2/1 construct artifact creature with flying and ward 1. If you do, it is an equipment. So it's one of those things, if our creature does die, our sword stays on the battlefield and then possibly could even become a creature, and it allows us to swing it at our opponent's face. Or we don't have to choose that, and we can still keep an equipment and equip it to a new creature. But it's definitely good in those situations. Maybe if they killed off our last creature and this was equipped to it, we can actually make it into a creature and still kind of, be a little bit more aggressive, even if there's nothing else going on in the battlefield. Then the Core Blade Master. It's a 2-mana 1/1 double striker. Equipped warriors we control have double strike, so it just makes all our warriors that much more aggressive and hit that much harder. Like I said, we do play a fair amount of equipment, so this definitely can be problematic if our opponent doesn't get rid of the Core Blade Master. And itself also has double strike, which is also very good for us. They get the Rune of Sustenance. It's a very interesting card in the deck, as it is one of those things that can enchant permanent. It's not just a creature, so we can enchant an equipment that may be on the battlefield. We can enchant a land, but the idea here is you're probably going to enchant an equipment, so once that equipment goes to something, it gets this benefit. But whenever as long as the enchanted permanent is a creature, it has lifelink. As long as the enchanted permanent is an equipment, an equipped creature has lifelink. So essentially the goal here is to put it on one of those two things. Worst case scenario, if you're really looking for that, card draw, we can pay 2 mana, put it on one of our lands, and still get the draw effect out of it. But the goal here is to put it on an equipment and/or a creature, just to get that lifelink ability, and essentially make whatever creature we have this on into like some sort of life gainer. Maybe one of our flyers has lifelink, and then we are getting that additional lifelink as we swing in aggressively against our opponent. Then you got Royal Eruption. It's a 2-mana sorcery with kicker 5. It deals 3 damage to any target. If the spell is kicked, it deals 5 damage instead. So it's just a big. It's a spell that in the early game is definitely very good for spot removal. And then the late game could be like that finisher if your opponent's low on life, hitting them for 5 damage to the face is definitely something they got to be on the watch out for. Sure, it does cost 7 mana, but in there it's definitely something that's plausible. You can waste your mana if you have nothing else to play on a 5 damage to the face kind of spell just to end the game overall. Then you got Rune of Speed, yet again, just like the Rune of Sustenance. It's a card that we're going to probably want to play on a creature and or a permanent, or equipment, I should say. An equipped creature has, our enchanted permanent creature is +1/+0, and has haste. And an enchanted permanent, as long as it's an equipment, it has +1/+0 and haste. So either or, we're going to give our creature haste and +1/+0 as long as it's an equipment and or a creature. And like I said, worst case scenario, if you need that card draw, you can always put it on a land. But overall, pretty solid card. Then the next card up is one of our other equipments in the deck. It's Scavenge Blades, a 2-mana equipment. When it enters the battlefield, you attach it to target creature you control. An equipped creature gets it +2/+0, and the equip cost is 3, which we can only play as a sorcery speed, so we can only either do it on first main phase or second main phase, and only during our turn. But the idea here is, once it comes on the battlefield, we could put on something like a Fireblade Charger on turn 2, and then make our Fireblade Charger 3/1, and then our opponent has to now consider, do they want to block a 3/1 and get dealt 3 damage on top of it, or are they going to let the 3 damage go through and maybe deal with it later? So definitely a very awesome card. I do like the idea that it's automatically attached to something as it comes on the battlefield. So overall, pretty solid card there. Then another, equipment in the deck, because that's the theme, like warriors and equipments. We have the Maul. The Skyclave is a 3-mana Maul. When it enters the battlefield, you have to attach it. You get to attach it to target creature control. An equipped creature has +2/+2 and has flying and first strike. So yet again, evasive damage as this creature now can go up and over most of the ground creatures. And the idea of also having first strike is also very good because it does block very well against certain things, especially against your opponent. If you put lifelink on something like this, you're going to gain that life first before the damage is dealt, which is always beneficial. Combine that with something like Core Blade Master on the battlefield. Now our opponent now it has +2/+2 lifelink and now double strike. It makes it even more aggressive. So overall, pretty awesome card that just synergizes very well with the deck. Then we got Arnie Broken Bow as a 1-of in the deck, a haster with a boast 1. You may change Arnie Broken Bow's base power to 1+ the greatest power among creatures you control until end of turn. So essentially, if there's a creature that's out on the battlefield that's much bigger than him, Arnie can become the exact same power and then get that 1 additional more and hits much harder. And it has haste, which is awesome. You probably want to play it on a turn that you can also boast at the same time as attacking, so it comes out into the battlefield much bigger, much stronger, and just slam it right into your opponent's face overall. Then we get the Dwarven Hammer, a 3-mana equipment that when it enters the battlefield, you may pay 2. If you do, create a 2/1 red dwarf berserker creature token, attach Dwarven Hammer to it. An equipped creature gets +3/+0 and has trample, so it's an equipment that can just be a +3/+0 in trampler, or you can pay the additional mana and also get a creature with it, and then also automatically equip that too. The idea of giving that creature trample makes it a 5/1 trampler, and now your opponent has to deal with it, and they can't just chump it because they're still going to dealt whatever damage isn't prevented by the toughness, to their face regardless. But overall, pretty decent top end kind of equipment for the deck that just kind of synergizes very well. Then you have Kargan War Leader, 3-mana 3/3. Other warriors you control get +1/+1, so it's like our warrior Lord. Just make all our warriors just initially, even not equipped, just that much stronger. It's something your opponent has to deal with, or our warriors going to start overrunning them just because they're coming out of the battlefield that much stronger. Then we have Halvar, God of Battle. It's a 4-mana 4/4. Creatures we control that are enchanted or equipped have double strike. So even regardless of us not having our thing that, our Core Blade Master, all our enchanted or equipped creatures now have double strike. And at the beginning of each combat, you may attach an aura or equipment attached to a creature control to target creature you don't control. So on our turn, we can swing in with a creature without an enchantment on it, put an aura or enchantment on it that may be on something else. And swing in and to get that ability. And then during our opponent's combat, we then can switch that all around and then have at least a creature. We can start transferring the weapons around based to maybe prevent your opponent from wanting to attack aggressively because they have to worry about you moving an equipment over and hitting them, regardless of the situation. And then the other idea here is you can play it as the flip side, and equipped creature gets +2/+0 and has vigilance, and whenever equipped creature dies, you get to return it to its owner's hand. So it's this decent ability that you can put on any creature, swing in aggressively, the creature's going to come back to your hand, and you're going to give it that creature +2/+0 and vigilance, which means it doesn't tap to attack. So it's just something your opponent has to kind of deal with. Like an idea of something putting it on like a Fireblade Charger. It's a 3/1 vigilancer that can swing in, attacking aggressively. Maybe if your opponent blocks, it now can throw the 3 damage wherever, comes back to your hand, replay it, and do it all over again the following turn. So overall, pretty interesting idea depending on the situation. You can choose either or. Halvar is probably a good finisher. Sort of Realms is kind of a good tempo play in the early game if you're trying to get into that early damage, kind of hitting your opponent as hard as possible. Then you have the Brenor Battle Hammer, 4 mana, 5/3. Each creature you control gets +2/+0 for each equipment you have attached to it, and then you may pay 0 rather than pay the cost of your first equip ability you activate each turn. So it essentially makes all our equips, free. The first equip free for the turn, and then giving the additional +2/+0 is even better. So take something that like our Scavenge Blade from just giving equip creature +2/+0 gives an additional +2, which makes it even better. Much is another card that helps us finish off the game. And him himself is a 5/3, so you can put equipments on him and make him even stronger and just that much more aggressive. Then we have Showdown of the Skulls. It's a 4 mana enchantment saga. It has 3 chapters. The first chapter is we exile the top 4 cards of our library until end of next turn, and we may play those cards. So it's kind of like a tempo play, if you're trying to draw a little bit of cards. And then whenever we cast spells this turn, we get to put a +1/+1 counters on target creatures you control on chapters 2 and 3, so you get 2 turns of it, allowing you to pump up your creatures as you play your spells, and it makes your opponent have to take your threats seriously just because they're going to get stronger and stronger the more spells you play on these 2 chapters. So overall, very solid tempo style card that helps you kind of finish out the game as well. Then we have 1 copy of Pigment Storm. It deals 5 damage to target creature, and excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller. So essentially, it's a burn spell with trample, I guess. So you may ping a 1/1 token, and that 4 damage is now going to go to that opponent's face. So overall, pretty decent card, not great card, but overall decent spot removal. That's a big spot removal. And then Lorehold Command is another great card in the deck. You choose 2, you get to create a 3/2 red-white spirit creature token. The second ability is creatures you control get +1/+0, gain indestructible and haste on that turn, so you can attack aggressively with it. And then the third ability, I should say, is it deals 3 damage to any target, and you gain 3 life, so it has a built-in Lightning Helix effect. And then the last ability is sacrifice a permanent and then draw 2 cards. So if you're really looking for an answer, you can always sacrifice something and always draw 2 cards out of it. So overall, very solid card. Definitely the +1/+0 indestructible and haste is definitely very solid for this deck. And the idea of also having a Lightning Helix in case you need that additional life gain, or even getting a 3/2 white spirit is also very good. Just keeping the board with creatures on it is always a very beneficial, and it's instant speed, so your opponent isn't going to expect it unless they know the deck in and out. So definitely a very awesome card. Then we have Shepherd of the Cosmos, the 6 mana, 3/3 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, return target permanent card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. But you can foretell it, so it makes the overall cost of it cheaper by paying 2 mana in the earlier phases. And whenever you're ready to flip it over, you can pay the 4 mana foretell cost, and then get back that creature with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So get back an equipment, get back a creature. You can even get back a land card if somehow a land ended up in the graveyard. Maybe sacrifice it to Lorehold Command. But overall, very interesting card here. Just kind of allows us to kind of re-establish. Maybe your opponent played a board wipe. This allows us to get our early game back on the battlefield and kind of overall in that way. And then the last card in the deck is a Comb Warrior. It's a 6 mana 4/5 Trampler. But the idea here is, it's a very big top end creature with trample, which putting equipments on this thing is very beneficial because of the trampling ability. And in the early game, if you really need the land, you can always play it as the other side, as the tap land, and get that additional red mana. So overall, very solid card that just fits that kind of depending on the situation, we can kind of figure it out. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward: 8 plains, 10 mountains, 4 of the Alpine Meadows, one of the Axgard Armory, which is another awesome card for this deck. Comes into play tapped. Tap it for white mana, and then for 4 mana and sacrificing it, you can search your library for an aura card or an equipment card, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle. So you get to actually search for 2 things, put them both in your hand for 4 mana, and then kind of set yourself up for the following turn. And then we got one of the white-red pathway. So overall, very interesting, equipment warrior style deck that's very tempo-y, very aggro, very aggressive. The goal here is just trying to play equipments onto creatures and just swing in aggressively and just try to, beat your opponent down, hopefully in the early turns of the game. So this next deck up is a deck that I'm actually kind of happy they kind of did. I mean, granted, it's not for everybody, but it's definitely cool they actually gave us a starter deck that is actually a control deck. And this deck is called Control Center. Essentially what it is a deck that is playing a lot of things to kind of slow down your opponent's early game and kind of set up for that mid to late game by playing, some big spells in the tail end of the deck. So overall, the idea here of the deck is to draw, just make your opponent discard, and destroy their creatures, so they really can't get any tempo out on the battlefield. And then the late game, like I said, it is to play, things like, Black Dragon, Blue Dragon, Undersea Invader, Emerith, Desert Doom, play some big things that your opponent just has to kind of deal with, but you have a lot of things to kind of slow them down from dealing with it. So in the 2-drop slot, it doesn't play any 1-drops. It has Curate. It's a very decent tempo card. Allows you look at the top 2 cards of your library, put any of them into your graveyard, put the rest back in your library in any order, and then draw a card. So either if you don't like the top 2 cards, maybe you're in the later game, you don't want to draw lands, you get 2 lands, you put them in your graveyard, and then you get to draw, a random card. Or if you get 2 cards you like, you can then look at them, put any of them in any order, and then put them back in your library, and then draw one, and then draw one maybe on the following turn. Then we got Reject. It's a very interesting counter creature spell or planeswalker spell unless your opponent pays 3, so it's very good in the early game. If that spell is countered this way, exile instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard, which is great in case there's decks that have a way to reoccur these kind of spells. So overall, a decent counter. Not a great counter in the late game because of your opponent can pay 3 and kind of negate it, but other than that, it's a pretty okay kind of counter spell. Then we got the Zim Royal Mage. It's a 2-mana 2/1 with a kicker ability. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. So it's kind of like one of those things in the early game. You can play it as a 2/1. In the late game, you can play it and then get back maybe that spot removal spell or maybe other sorcery or instant spell that maybe helps you with the situation you're currently in. So overall, very decent card that has some flexibility depending on the situation and what part of the game you are in. Then we have the Elderfang Disciple, 2-mana 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. So it's just a very, disrupting your opponent's hand. Maybe your opponent doesn't have many lands, or maybe they don't have a lot of spells. You're making them discard things. In the early game, it's okay. It's not as great because your opponent has a bunch of cards they can discard. But in the late game, when their hands getting thin, maybe they only have 2 or 3 cards in hand. They can discard one of those cards, especially if it's like the choices between like a land and maybe their big spell. It's one of those things they want to just get rid of the land to play the big spell, or do they want to get rid of the big spell and hopefully draw another big spell. So yet again, it's a very interesting card. Very hand hate is always very good in control decks just because less cards your opponent has, the less spells they can possibly cast. Then you got Flunk. It's a 2-mana instant spell that target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is 7 minus the number of cards in that creature's controller's hand. So if your opponent has no cards in hand, it's -7/-7. If they have 6 cards in hand, so -1/-1. So it's a very good late game kind of removal spell because it gives -/. Which is very good in things that are indestructible, because indestructibility doesn't prevent creatures if it goes below 0 from dying that way. So minus cards are definitely very good. And I do think Flunk is going to kind of be that spell that in standard as a whole, this could be like the 2-mana removal spell, just because of its ability to kind of affect your opponent's creatures depending on what the situation is when it comes to the game. Then in the 3-drop slot, we got the Dragon Turtle, which is a new card from Adventures of the Forgotten Realms. It has Flash Dragon and has the ability called Drag Below. When it enters the battlefield, tap it and up to 1 target creature your opponent controls, and they don't untap during their control's next on tap step. So you can do it on their turn if they're going to swing in with a big creature, or you can do it on your turn and not play for its Flash ability and actually tap something down on their following turn, and then have this ready because even if you play it on your turn, it has Summon Sickness, so it can't attack anyway. So if you're preventing your opponent from maybe doing something with that creature that's on the battlefield on their turn, you then untap this and have it as a blocker and or attacker for the following turn. So overall, very good tempo-y kind of card. Depending on the situation, you can either flash it or play it as its regular cost. Then you find the Villain's Lair. It's a 3-mana instant spell. You get to choose one. You get to foil the scheme, counter target spell. It's a 3-mana counter spell. Or you can learn the secrets, draw 2 cards, and then discard 2 cards. So yet again, very interesting card here. I do like the flexibility depending on what the situation is. If you need to really draw those 2 cards, you can always do so. But at the end of the day, you can always counter a target spell, which is pretty awesome. And having that flexibility on the same card is also pretty cool. Then we have the Callous Blood Mage. It's 3-mana 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, you have to choose one. You get to create a green-white-black pest token creature. And you get to draw a card and lose a life, or you get to exile target player's graveyard. So overall, depending on the situation, you can always kind of figure it out. I mean, it's always good to exile player's graveyard if you think they have some sort of way to recur things from the graveyard. You can just get a chump blocker with a 1/1 pest, or you can draw a card and lose a life as kind of that tempo-y kind of replace this card as you play it kind of thing. Yet again, it's kind of one of those things you got to figure out depending on the situation of the game. You get the Vampire Spawn, a 3-mana 2/3. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses 2 life. You gain 2 life. It's a 2/3, which is pretty decent. nothing too great, but the idea here, it also kind of drains your opponent's life a little bit and you gain some life is also very good. So you can use that as a chump blocker, gain a little bit of life in the process, and save yourself from maybe getting hit with an attack. So overall, pretty okay card in the deck. You got Poison the Cup. It's a 3-mana instant spell that destroys target creature. If the spell is foretold, you get to scry 2. And yet again, I feel like I'm on the fence with this. I haven't seen too much play with it. It's just one of those things I think when removal is 3 mana, it doesn't just feel as strong as something that's 2 mana. And the idea here is that you essentially have to pay 4 mana to actually, cast it for its foretell cost, which doesn't make it feel that great just to get a scry 2 out of it. So overall, that's probably why you haven't seen a lot of people play Poison the Cup. You may have seen some people play it, but it's not as much around as say something like Flunk, or even the new power word death card from Adventures of the Forgotten Realms. You have Contact Other Plane. It's a 4-mana instant spell. You have to roll a d20, 1 through 9, draw 2 cards, 10 through 19, scry 2, then draw 2 cards, and then 20, we have to scry 3 and then draw 3 cards. So again, it's one of those things you're going to draw 2 cards regardless, but the higher you roll, that you're going to get a scry out of it, either 2, or if you roll a natural 20, you get to get a scry 3 and also draw 3 additional card. So overall, this is one of those things you play at the end of your opponent's turn. Hopefully get lucky, maybe get the 10 through 19, get a scry 2 and draw 2 cards, look for answers to maybe deal with what your opponent's dealing on the battlefield. You get the Baleful Master, which I do kind of like as a spell because of its flexibility. You can pay the 4 mana, but you can also pay 2 mana instead. If the 2 mana was paid, an opponent gets to draw a card, but you get to exile a target creature or planeswalker, and sometimes exile a creature or planeswalker is just what you need. Even if your opponent's going to draw a card out of it, sometimes it's just better to let them draw a card if you're going to exile something that could be, doing something devastating to you, whether it's hitting your life points or even as a planeswalker that's getting close to an ultimate, you don't want them to go off. This is definitely a card that can maybe solve that problem. The next card up is Skull Raid. It's a 4-mana sorcery. Target opponent discards 2 cards. If fewer than 2 cards were discarded this way, you draw cards equal to the difference. So in the early game, you can set it up, which I do think this is okay because, even when you foretell it and play its foretell cost, it's still going to cost the same mana, which is definitely very good. And the idea here is you can either wait for your opponent to have no cards in hand, or maybe wait till they have 1 card in hand, then make them discard that card, and also you get to draw a card out of it. So overall, pretty decent card that has some flexibility. In the worst case scenario, you pay the 4 mana and you make them discard 2 cards, just to make them discard and maybe make that tough choice. So, make your opponent make those choices by getting rid of cards in your hand is always very good. Then you get the Gelatinous Cube, which I do think is actually much better than what I feel like some people gave it when it first came out, and I do think so. People have turned a corner on it, but essentially it's the mono black version of the Skyclave. The Skyclave, whatchamacallit, the 3-mana white spell, but there's a slight difference here. I mean, it's a 4 mana for a 4/3, has the Engulf ability, which exiles target non-ooze, puts it underneath the Gelatinous Cube until it leaves the battlefield. But the idea here is in the later game, if you have anything to do, you can always pay X in a black and put target creature card with a mana value X exiled with Gelatinous Cube into its owner's graveyard, so it just eats that creature, and now the creature's dead. So even if your opponent kills the Gelatinous Cube, they're not going to get that creature back. So it definitely has some flexibility. I do think it's slightly better than the Skyclave, just because of being able to kind of remove the creature completely. Whereas Skyclave, you only exile it, and if the Skyclave dies, then your opponent gets a creature back with the converted mana cost. So it's a pretty interesting card for black, I do think, and it's definitely pretty cool just because it's a giant cube of Jello. Then we have Emerith, Desert Doom, 5-mana, 5/5 flyer, and it has ward 4 as long as it's untapped, so it makes it very hard to remove, unless your opponent has some sort of global removal. And then whenever it deals damage to a player, draw a card. If you have fewer than 3 cards in hand, draw cards equal to the difference. So if you have 1 card in hand, you get to draw 2. If you have 0 cards in hand, you get to draw up a total of 3. So definitely a very good flexible card. Though when you do attack, it doesn't have vigilance, so it does become tapped, and therefore it doesn't have ward anymore. But that ward 4 is great just because it slows down a bunch of spells that would be able to be cast on it. Your opponent does have to have a lot of mana in order to really deal with it. Then the next card up is Mind Flayer. It's a 5-mana 3/3 dominate monster. When it enters the battlefield, gain control of target creature for as long as you control Mind Flayer. So it's just one of those things. As long as Mind Flayer is on the battlefield, you have control of whatever creature your opponent controls, as long as it's out on the battlefield. So overall, pretty cool card. Just being able to take something of your opponent's and use that creature against your opponent's always a good feeling. I mean, it makes maybe tilts some of your opponents, but overall, just to have that kind of style in the style deck is definitely very good. Then the Undersea Invader, it's a 6-mana 5/6 with flash, so you can play at the end of your opponent's turn, and just battlefield taps, so untaps your upkeep if you do that, or you can play on your turn and just have it tapped. But I would probably play it and maybe wait for a situation maybe at the end of your opponent's turn just to get it out on the battlefield, and then untap to attack him with it immediately. It's not very good to play it on your turn as just a normal creature. And then we have one copy of Blue Dragon. It's a 7 mana 5/5 with Lightning Breath. When enters the battlefield into your next turn, creature an opponent controls is -3/-0. Another one gets -2/-0, and another one gets -1/-0. So overall, just a card that kind of shrinks a lot of your opponent's creatures, which makes them less ineffective to maybe swing back in. And it's a 5/5 in itself, which is definitely very good. It's definitely one of those cards that kind of slows down your opponent's maybe aggro plan, just because of its being able to do that to 3 different creatures, which is very interesting. And then the other dragon we have in the deck is Black Dragon, 7 mana 4/4 with Acid Breath. When it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -3/-3 until end turn. This one's probably the weaker of a lot of the uncommon dragons, just because -3/-3 isn't great for 7 mana. But -3/-3 still gets rid of indestructible, so that's very good. But other than that, it's just a very generic dragon that's costs 7 mana for only a 4/4. So you take it where you leave it, but this one is probably one of those ones that I'm just not really a big fan of. And then the mana base is pretty interesting here because I do think this is the only starter deck that has 26 lands in it, but we have 10 islands, 10 swamps, 1 of the pathways, 4 of the ice tunnels, and 1 port of Carfell. And just battlefield tapped. We can pay 5 mana or 6 mana, sacrifice it, mill 4 cards, return a creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So we can get back any of our dragons, can get back our Emerith, depending on what may have died. And we can do it at instant speed, so we can do it at the end of our opponent's turn and get that creature back, and then tap it during our upkeep and maybe swing back in with it immediately. So overall, pretty interesting deck. Definitely cool, like I said, to see a control deck in a starter deck form, so that players, if they want to try control, this definitely could be the deck they could try out. Now, this next deck up is another interesting deck. It's kind of like it's a dungeon Delvin deck, so it's playing the new Venture ability that came with Adventures from the Forgotten Realms, and it's also playing some interesting party mechanics, as well as you kind of see some of the cards will utilize to the party mechanic that kind of get introduced with Zendikar Rising. But overall, the idea of the deck is to venture and also try to get a presence to hopefully delve enough into your dungeon to complete one and then get certain abilities and effects as the game goes on. In the 1-drop slot, we have Ranger's Hawk. It's a 1 mana 1/1 flyer that has the 3 tap another untapped creature control and venture into a dungeon. Activate only as a sorcery. So the one downfall here is we can only do it on our turn, and I do think that's kind of one of the things that makes this card not so great, but interesting card. Just kind of be able to delve a little bit deeper into a dungeon, maybe get to a certain ability that you're trying to hit, so you can maybe get through that dungeon much quicker. But overall, pretty interesting 1/1 flyer that kind of maybe gets in from early points of damage. And maybe in the later game, if you just have additional creatures that really can't attack in very well, you just tap 3, tap this, and tap something else to just delve a little bit deeper. Then we have Thunderous Orator. It's a 2 mana 2/2 with Vigilance. Whenever it attacks, it gains flying to end of turn if you control a creature flying. And the same is true for First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, and Trample. So it can gain all those abilities if we have creatures that have those abilities on the battlefield whenever it goes to attack. Like I said, it can gain the ability of Ranger's Hawk, and gain the ability of something with Death Touch, Lifelink. So overall, very interesting card here, and it's very, a 2/2 for 2 that also has Vigilance is also very good because it can swing in and also become a decent blocker. So overall, interesting card. They have Demonic Gifts, 2 mana. Until end of turn, target creature gets +2/+0, and whenever this creature dies, return to the battlefield under its owner's control. So it's just a card that has reoccurrence and gives it a little bit of pump in the process. So we can attack and aggressively get the creature back on the battlefield. So overall, pretty interesting card. Just kind of get the extra points of damage. Then we have the Malakir Blood Priest. It's 2 mana 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent loses X life. We gain X life, where X is the number of creatures in our party. Like I was saying, there's some things that if you kind of look at the creature types, we are playing creatures of certain parts of the party. So you can probably get 2, 3, maybe even 4 if you get lucky pieces of the party out on the battlefield, and then maybe be able to drain your opponent for 4 life and gain 4 life in the process. Then we have the Null Priest of Oblivion. It's a very solid card here. It's 2 mana 2/1 with Menace and Lifelink. Menace is very cool because your opponent has to commit 2 cards to it in order to block it. Lifelink is also very good, so if your opponent doesn't have things to possibly block it, you're going to gain 2 life out of it. And we can kick it for 4 whenever it enters the battlefield. If it was kicked, we get to return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. So it has kind of like a reanimate kind of ability built into it in the later game. This is definitely something that helps us kind of get something that may have been removed or died earlier in the battle back onto the battlefield later in the game. Maybe if we want to get back one of our creatures that may trigger Venture when it enters the battlefield. It's one of those things that, depending on the situation, you kind of figure out what you want and get it back with this card. Then we have the Triumphant Adventurer, 2 mana, black and a white, 1/1 Death Toucher. As long as it's our turn, Triumphant Adventurer has First Strike. Whenever it attacks, it ventures into a dungeon. I think it's an okay card. It's not a great card, but it's definitely an okay card because of 1/1 with Death Touch. Our opponent's not really going to want to have their big creature die to a 1/1. But the idea here is every time it attacks, we do definitely get to venture into a dungeon. The other thing too I forgot to mention, First Strike is also very good on this card because even if our opponent has a bigger creature and their creature may not have First Strike, the First Strike will make the Death Touch trigger first, killing their creature and leaving the Triumphant Adventurer behind in the process. So definitely a very solid card. Then with the Vanish Inverse, yet again another 2-mana spell at instant speed. Exile target monocolor permanent. Definitely very good to get rid of something pesky that's monocolored. Though the one downfall is it can only exile monocolored things. It can't target things like itself, like a gold border card. So it is kind of limited on what it can target. But overall, for 2 mana, it's definitely very good because it doesn't destroy it; actually exiles. So it's definitely cool. And the Cloister Gargoyle, it's a 3-mana 0/4 when it enters the battlefield. Venture to a dungeon. As long as we complete a dungeon, it gets +3/+0 and flying. So it's a decent blocker. And then in the later game, once we get closer to completing a dungeon, it's going to have +3/+0 and be maybe an aggressive attacker and and have flying in the process. So it's not going to be able to be blocked by things on the ground. Then we have the Gloomstalker. It's a 3-mana 2/3. As long as we complete a dungeon, it has double strike. So yet again, one of those cards that benefit from us completing a dungeon. And double strike is definitely very good because it has technically double strike counts as first strike, and also it gets to do damage on its second, the second part of combat if for normal damage. So definitely pretty cool nonetheless. Then with our Selfless Paladin, 3-mana 3/3 vigilance. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, venture into a dungeon, and creatures we control have +1/+1 as long as we have completed a dungeon. So it in itself has like a a global anthem effect, and it's definitely pretty cool that even when it enters and or attacks, we're going to be going through multiple levels of a dungeon in maybe a possible single turn. Then next card up is Acerak, the Archlich, 3-mana 5/5. When it enters the battlefield, if you haven't completed Tomb of Annihilation, return it to its hand, venture into a dungeon. Whenever it attacks, for each opponent, you create a 2/2 zombie creature token unless that player sacrifices a creature. So the idea here is you can play himself to go deeper into a Tomb of Annihilation and hopefully complete it so you can then keep him out in the battlefield and then slowly get zombies out unless your opponent wants to sacrifice creatures, preventing you from getting zombies. So overall, very interesting card, though I do think its secondary ability is more of a commander ability, but nonetheless, it's definitely a cool card that has, yet again, another venture mechanic. Then Perpetuous Drop is a 3-mana enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, venture to a dungeon. Enchanted creatures -2/-2, or it gets -5/-5 as long as we completed a dungeon. So in the early game, it's -2/-2. In the late game, once we complete that first dungeon, -5/-5, which is definitely very good. And yet again, -5/-5 is much better against indestructible creatures because that goes through indestructibility. Yuan-Ti Fangblade, it's a 3-mana 2/2 Death Toucher. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, venture to a dungeon. So yet again, as you can see here, there's a lot of synergy that is just helping us dig deeper and deeper into a dungeon. So I think the idea here is probably what you want to do is probably complete this one, which is kind of the more aggressive dungeon, just to kind of be able to get him out in the battlefield once you eventually draw him, and then maybe go into one of the other bigger dungeons and go from there. Then Veteran Dungeoneer, it's a 4-mana 3/4. When it enters the battlefield, you get to venture into a dungeon, and then yet again goes to the dungeon 3/4 4-mana, very solid. Then you have Barrowwind, Clan of the Undur. 4-mana 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, venture to a dungeon. Surprise. Whenever Barrowwind, Clan of the Undur attacks, return up to 1/2 creature card with a converted mana cost 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield once you've completed the dungeon. So it has an ability to get back any of our other cards from the deck that are smaller than it converted mana cost wise back onto the battlefield, which is definitely very awesome once we complete that first dungeon. Then we have several cool command. 4-mana sorcery, choose 2. Target creature gets +3/+3 and flying. So maybe give it to one of our creatures that may have a venture whenever it attacks. So maybe it flies over maybe some ground creatures, and then we get to return target creature card with converted mana cost 2 or less from a graveyard to the battlefield. So it has a reanimate ability. And then third ability is get target player draws a card and loses a life, and the target opponent sacrifices a creature. So depending on the situation, you're more than likely going to choose the first two, but in some situations you may choose option 3 or 4 also. Then the last card up in the deck that's not land is Closing Statements, 5-mana removal spell, but does cost 2 less to cast during our end step, so it's something we can do at the end of our turn, which is kind of a weird phase to kind of play a removal spell, but you get to destroy target creature or planeswalker we don't control, and then we get to put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature we control. So overall, it's a very flexible removal spell. It's a 5-mana removal spell, or in certain situations, at the end of our turn, it's a 3-mana removal spell. So a pretty cool card to play in the deck. And the mana base is pretty straightforward. 9 plains, 10 swamps, 1 of the pathways, 4 of the Snow Fiend sinkholes. So overall, very interesting adventure, delver, diver deck, but pretty cool to kind of see something with like party/adventure mechanics combined together. Now the last deck up in the deck is Fireworks, which is an Izzet style deck, or Prismari style deck, depending on how you want to say it. But overall, the idea of the deck, it's playing various things. We have multiple choice, an X cost spell that costs 1 blue. If X is 1, we get to draw a card. If X is 2, we get to choose a player. They return a creature they control to the owner's hand. X is 3, we get to create a 4/4 blue elemental creature token. If X is 4, we get to choose all the above. So definitely pretty cool, flexible card for the deck. Then we have Arcane Investigator, 2 mana, 2/1, search the room. We can pay 6 mana, we roll a d20. 1 through 9, we get to draw a card. 10 through 20, we get to look at top 3, put one of them through our hand, the rest on the bottom of our library. Thunderous Rebuke, it's a 2 mana, deal 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker, sorcery speed spell, so just a spot removal spell for creatures and planeswalkers. Kaza Royal Chaser, 2 mana, 1/2 flying haster. Tap it. Instance of sorcery spells you cast X less to cast, where X is the number of wizards we control as this ability resolves. So the deck is playing a bunch of wizards to make our spells cost less, which makes our bigger top end spells in our deck be able to be played earlier in the deck, which is definitely pretty cool. And also, I believe counts for the X in this. So if we even only have 2 mana out, we do resolve something like this. We can make, we can get, X is 3 or X is 2 for even cheaper without actually having to pay the additional X. In the Prismari Pledge Mage, it's a 2 mana 3/3 defender with Magecraft. Whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, it can attack as though it didn't have defender. So it's a decent blocker, and then in certain situations, maybe after the turn we play, we cast that instant or sorcery, it can now attack in for 3 damage, which is definitely pretty awesome. Then we have Mentor's Guidance, 3 mana sorcery spell. When we cast this spell, we control a planeswalker, cleric, druid, shaman, warlock, or wizard. We get to scry one and draw a card. So essentially, if we have any of those creature types on the battlefield, we'll get multiple copies of the spell as we cast it. Though our deck is made up of mostly wizards, so we're more than likely only going to copy, the once, which is definitely still pretty good. Scrying one and drawing a card is definitely very good. And doing it twice is definitely awesome. Then we got Demon Bolt. It's a 3 mana spell. It deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. We can foretell it for 1. So all in all, it's a decent, removal spell in, this deck, as it can deal 4 damage to anything. And we can either pay for its 3 mana cost, or we can foretell it and then play for its 1 mana, but essentially 3 mana cost regardless. Then we have Aeger, the Freeze and Flame. It's a 3 mana blue and a red 3/3. Whenever a creature or planeswalker opponent controls, deal extra damage by. If a giant wizard or spell you control is dealt damage to its turn. Wait, hold on. Sorry, I read that weird. Whenever a creature, planeswalker, and opponent controls dealt excess damage, if a giant wizard or a spell you control dealt damage to it this turn, draw a card. So all in all, it's just one of those things. If one of our creatures or spells has dealt excess damage to a creature, we'll draw a card out of it. So it gives all our burn spells that additional damage, or the ability to possibly give us an additional card draw out of it, even if the card doesn't say it. Then we have Prismari Command, 3 mana instant spell. We get to choose to. Prismari Command deals 2 damage to any target. Target player just draws 2 and then discards 2. Target player creates a treasure token and destroy target artifact. More than likely, you're gonna probably ping something for 2 and then probably create a treasure token as kind of that temple we kind of style play. But in some situations, you may do the second ability and or the fourth ability. Then you have the Umara Mystic, 3 mana, 1/3 flyer. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, it gets +2/+0 to end a turn. So it's kind of like a built-in prowess or one of those kind of abilities. So it's going to get bigger. Though it's going to be hard to set up playing multiple spells, but it does synergize very well with the Mentor's Guidance. If we copy that multiple times, it can get +4/+0, which is definitely very good. And swinging it in the air is definitely very awesome. Then you have Meteor Swarm. It's an X 3 mana spell. It deals 8 damage divided as among we choose to X targets where creatures are planeswalkers. So yet again, it's a spell depending on the situation. You may pay 2, you may pay 3 for the X, and then you can split that 8 damage depending on how you need to across the things. Though it is kind of expensive because if you want to do 3 creatures, you're gonna have to pay 6 mana, 2 creatures 5 mana, 1 creature 4 mana. So a very interesting card, but 8 damage is definitely very good. It definitely gets rid of something very, very big. Maybe Archmage Emertus. It's a 4 mana 2/2 Magecrafter. Whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we get to draw a card. So it's a very tempo-y kind of play. Replaces the card we're casting essentially every time we play one of those spells, which is definitely very good, which may also help us draw into maybe other spells that we can cast. Then we have Demolish, which is a new card from Adventure of the Forgotten Realms. This spell costs 1 blue less to cast for each instant or sorcery spell we cast this turn. Whenever it attacks, exile up to 1 target instant or sorcery card spell from our graveyard, copy it, and we cast that copy. And you may cast Demolish from our graveyard by exiling 4 instant or sorcery cards from our graveyard in addition to paying its other costs. So Definitely very interesting card that can get reoccur. So if our opponent can't, exile it when it goes to the graveyard, we can get it back. 4/3 is definitely pretty decent. Definitely very solid tempo-y style play. Name of the Basalt Ravager. It's a 4-mana 4/2. When it enters the battlefield, deal X damage to any target, where X is the greatest among number of creatures you control that have a creature type in common. We are playing wizards, so most of the time we'll have wizards in common, so we'll be able to do X damage to any target where X is equal to those many wizards we have. They're the Rock Slide Sorcerer, 4-mana 3/3. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery or wizard spell, it deals 1 damage to any target. So yet again, a thing that's going to help us ping things if they're going to get rid of small things, or just ping our opponent in the face depending on the situation. I think the Maelstrom Muse, it's a 4-mana 2/4 flyer. Whenever it attacks the next instant or sorcery spell, this turn costs X less to cast, where X is the Maelstrom Muse's power as this ability resolves. So most of the time it's going to resolve for, making some cost 2x less, which is definitely very good. Very, very good to synergize with something like a Meteor Swarm for 5. Instead of we only have to pay the 3 red mana, which is also very good. But overall, pretty decent card to helps us with our tempo style burn strategy. Then you have Faradas Fireball. It's a 5-mana instant spell. It deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker. Roll d20. 1 through 9 deals 2 damage to each player. 10 through 20 deals 2 damage to each opponent. So one of those spells that, besides it doing 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker, we can also possibly hit our opponent in the face. Sometimes we also get hit in the process, but, it's okay as it's something that can help deal with some big things on the battlefield. Then in the top end of the deck, we have Aircutter Elemental. It's a 6-mana 2/5 flyer with Whirlwind. When it enters the battlefield, return up to 1 target creature to its owner's hand. So we can bounce something back that our opponent controls that's just pesky in the way. We can even bounce something back in our side of the battlefield, which, though I would say there's not many things that really have an enter the battlefield effect. But yet again, it's just a decent card that has flying and can bounce something back to our opponent's hand. And the last card in the deck is Creative Outburst. It's a 7-mana spell. It deals 5 damage to any target. We have to look at the 5 cards of our library, put one of them to our hand, the rest on the bottom of our library in any order. And for 2 mana, we can discard it and create a treasure token. So essentially, this is kind of like the whatchamacallit of the deck, even though we don't play it. I can't think of the card name off the top of my head, but it's the same mana. Does kind of a similar ability, but we don't get the token out of it. But overall, very good card for it being more of a starter deck. And nonetheless, yet again, because we are playing this kind of like higher end deck with maybe possibly needing that additional mana, we are playing 25 lands in this deck. It's 10 islands, 10 mountains, 1 of the pathways, and 4 of the fjords. So overall, very interesting deck for this starter, for the Prismari starter. This is something you're looking for. I would say it's more of a tempo-y style wizard tribal deck, but definitely a cool deck to try out if this is kind of up your alley when it comes to playing Magic. Now, I mean, like I said, each of these decks are decks that you'll be getting in Arena for free at some point, probably closer as we get to August or maybe into early August. Is relative what I'm guessing, because that's kind of roughly when we got them last year. But if you're a new player, these are the decks you are unlocking. I probably will at some point when the decks do get released into Arena, I will do a follow-up upgrade video to those decks. If you haven't seen the deck, the first 5 decks, I will have a card somewhere here as you kind of watching the outro to this video. But until next time, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, when I'll post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, I'll see you later.